Hello, my lovely biology students. I hope this finds you well. A couple of announcements to remember as we go through this week, with me being in Missouri for the week. You will have Lecture 6 today, and you can listen to it. There's going to be different segments because I max out at 15 minutes, which is a good thing for some of you. I'm sure you can get it in little chunks. And the quiz on Friday will open in Moodle at noon. It'll be open from noon to 1:10. You'll have a 10-minute time limit, and it will just be over Lecture 6, which is what I'm starting right now. So make sure you find a time to get onto a computer, and if you don't have one of your own, get to a computer lab to take that quiz. Okay, so I do have the tests in the gradebook, and you'll be seeing those the next time you see me. Overall, I think you all did really well on it. Some of you need to bolster up on your study habits, I think, for the next one, but overall the average was an 85%, which I think was really good. Of course, that is after a little curve, a little 4-point curve. So let's dive into this. This is talking about different processes the cell can do. There's going to be some overlap in this lecture with things that we already talked about with the characteristics of life, and so hopefully we kind of see that going around full circle. I may talk quickly so that I can abide by some of those time limits. Please understand you can pause whenever you want, you can rewind, you can listen to this as much as possible and as much as you need, so don't feel like you have to keep up with my pace that we would in class. I'm going to keep clicking, and then you take your time with this as you need, okay? So one thing that we've already talked about is that all living things need a way to obtain and use energy. Okay, and so maybe some of us don't really know what energy is. And the scientific definition of energy is the capacity to do work, which is not that complex of a definition, truthfully. And then, of course, if you're in physics and chemistry, there are formula we can use to calculate the amount of work done and the amount of energy expended, and we're not going to go into that, but the thing that we need to know is that our biosphere, for the most part, gets energy from the sun. I know there was a lovely test question talking about how energy is moved through the biosphere. And so we need to remember that on Earth, almost all food webs and food chains start with that energy from the sun, and then it gets converted into other forms. Now, when we measure energy, and this is a great lead into some things that you're going to be looking at this week in lab as you research those energy drinks, is, well, how do we measure energy? And there's actually quite a few ways that we do, but the one that you're most familiar with is the word calorie, right? And here's the definition of calorie. It's the amount of heat required to raise the temperature of 1 gram of water by 1 degree Celsius. So we use water as our norm, our control group, because I know water behaves very differently than other liquids, but at the same time it's so ubiquitous within cells and in our world that that's our standard. Okay, so if you think about 1 gram of water, a gram is like the same weight as a paperclip. Okay, so not much, and the amount of heat needed to raise 1 gram of water by 1 degree Celsius. Now, that's actually, it doesn't take much. And so when you read calories on food labels, those are actually kilocalories. I know we call them calories, but that is that's something that's different between the scientific world and the regular world, is that the scientific calorie is actually 1,000th of the big calorie C. So calorie with a capital C is the same as a kilocalorie, and it's really just a matter of labels were tired of writing out all of those zeros, right? So we knocked a few off, and that's what we see on food packages. You don't need to know the difference. It's just a matter of, in science, sometimes you might see numbers for calories that are really, really high, and it's because on food labels you're actually seeing kilocalories. So here's an example. Here's my lovely peanut butter M&Ms that some of you all know that I love, and for a serving size, which luckily doesn't tell me how many M&Ms, so I'm going to assume it's as many as I can eat in one sitting. It is 240 calories. Remember, that's capital C. So truthfully, if we were talking about scientific calories with a little c, we would have to add 3 more zeros after that. So this is, like I said, in lab this week, you're going to be looking at the nutrition values and the ingredients of that energy drink that you tested last week, and you're going to be looking at the calories, because that literally means how much energy that can be used in your cells. Okay? So, thinking about energy, this may be review. Hopefully this isn't the first time you've heard about the fact that we have some scientific laws, not theories, but actual laws about energy. The first is called the law of conservation of energy. This is the idea that energy cannot be created or destroyed, but it's changed from one form to another. Mass also has a similar law to this. And the second law is that while we change energy from one form to another, it actually gets less efficient, less usable, right? So it kind of has this, even though it never is gone, it's not destroyed, it doesn't disappear, I guess, if you want to think about it that way. When it does change form, it always goes to a less usable form of energy. And truthfully, heat is the least usable form of energy. Okay? So thinking about that, we need to consider even those food webs that we talked about, and we'll get to a slide that has some pictures of that, that when we transfer energy from the sun to the plants and then plants to the animals, the energy is not quote-unquote lost per se, but it is going into a form that is not as usable as solar energy or chemical energy. Another sciencey word is entropy. Okay, and not going to be on the test, but this is kind of an interesting thing to think about. And of course, this goes into that second law that we just looked at, that as energy gets transferred from one form to another, it is going to increase the amount of disorganization and disorder. So we kind of say this is the tendency for everything to go to chaos. And so entropy is actually a measurement of the relative amount of disorganization in a system. And chemistry and physics, we talk about this a lot more, but it's a matter of thinking as energy is transferred between living organisms or the environment and organisms, it's going to go towards disorganization or this measure of entropy. And so the only way to bring order back into the system is to add energy. And so as energy degrades down into lesser usable forms, we have to add energy to convert that into usable forms again. So here's a little, and there's some examples that we're going to talk about here in a second. But here's one. So energy is provided by the sun, and that runs the process of photosynthesis. That allows plants to make glucose. You should know that, C6H12O6. But as a consequence of that, it becomes more disorganized, right? From the sun's energy to make glucose, it's going to be more disorganized than the water and carbon dioxide that it takes to make that. So, and of course the idea is the rest of that energy is lost as heat. You don't think about plants producing heat, but anytime energy is being transferred, some heat is lost. And so again, thinking about that flow of energy from sun to plants, plants to animals, some of that energy gets lost in the transfer. And again, when I use the term lost, it doesn't disappear, it's just not usable. So as the flow of energy through this little simple food web, each time energy is transferred, it becomes more disorganized and heat is lost. Here's something else to think about. Entropy can be shown in your dorm room, I'm sure, right? That over time, your dorm room or your bedroom tends towards chaos and disorganization. And the only way to go from disorganization back to an organized form is to add energy, in this case physical energy, to put up all of your dirty clothes and things like that. When it comes to cells, I have kind of a before and after picture here. We talked about the cell membrane, and so you can see these lovely little phospholipids here, right? It's a bilayer, 2 layers of phospholipids, and then we have this channel protein. Okay, so over here on the left, we have a high amount of hydrogen ions. Okay, And on the right side of this channel protein, there's none. So we would say this on the left side is a high concentration of hydrogen ions, and the right side would be a low concentration. And so what we see here is that this is more organized. It has more potential energy because of this buildup on one side, but it's less stable, okay? But it has less entropy. As we flow hydrogen ions through the channel protein in order to balance it out and have an equal distribution of hydrogen ions, it becomes less organized, have less potential energy. However, it becomes more stable and has more entropy. Okay, so again, just something to think about. I'm not going to quiz you a lot about entropy here, but it does drive a lot of the other cellular mechanisms that we're going to see later. So that's kind of the scientific law that's driving some of these procedures. Okay, so check out my little plasma membrane there. Hopefully that's familiar to you. A molecule you do need to know is called adenosine triphosphate, or ATP. We've mentioned this already, that ATP is produced through cellular respiration as cells break down glucose with oxygen to produce carbon dioxide, water, and energy. And energy is in the form of ATP. ATP is actually a molecule that should look familiar. It's got this base here, it's got a sugar, and it's got 3 phosphate groups. And when you put a nitrogen containing base, a sugar, and phosphate groups together, you get a nucleotide. So this is not a nucleotide that builds to make DNA, but it is the same type of molecule as we find in DNA. And ATP is the type of energy that all cells need to carry out those small activities inside the cell. We think glucose, we think sugar, we think fat when it comes to energy, and that's partially true, but those molecules on their own are actually way too powerful for the cell to use outright. We've got to convert those molecules of the triglycerides, the glucose, the sucrose, the starches, we've got to convert those into smaller units and transfer that energy to ATP, which is the perfect size for cells to use. Okay, so again, that's a nucleotide, that's a monomer of nucleic acids. Hopefully that's memorable as well. So ATP has those 3 phosphate groups, and what cells can do with the help of some other chemicals is they can liberate or free this 3rd phosphate group, and ATP, which the T stands for tri, becomes ADP, adenosine diphosphate, di meaning 2. So you can see here there's 3 phosphate groups in ATP, and in ADP one of the phosphate groups has been broken off. Okay, and they have a little picture of a battery and the little energizer bunny to remind you that ATP is like a full battery. Okay, it's ready to go. And ADP, we've used some of the energy and now the battery's not fully charged. Now the cool thing is the cell can actually go back and forth. There's chemicals that can break off that 3rd phosphate group to become ADP, and then there's other chemicals that can add the 3rd phosphate group to ADP to become ATP again. And so as the phosphate group is broken off, energy is released. As the phosphate group is added, it stores energy for later. Okay, so you look at my arrows here. ADP to ATP is storing energy, like when we break down glucose in the mitochondria through cellular respiration. We're going to charge up those ADP batteries to ATP. But then when the muscle cells need to contract or other things need to occur, the energy in ATP is used. Here's a nice little molecular picture of ATP. You can see the 3 parts. It is a nucleotide. ATP is these phosphate, the bonds between the phosphate groups are actually really easy to break off and put back. And so it's just enough energy to get the amount to do a cellular job. Okay. No, it's not going to contract your whole bicep, but little by little, each individual muscle fibers can contract. All right. So I'm going to pause right here and you'll get started on this slide in the next lecture.